Our scripture reading today is found in the book of Isaiah, chapter 46, verses 3 to 4 and 8 to 10. Listen to God's word. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel who have been born by me from your birth, carried from the womb. Even to your old age, I am he. Even to when you turn gray, I will carry you. I have made and I will bear. I will carry and will save. Remember this and consider, recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God, and there is no one like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my purpose shall stand, and I will fulfill my intention. Here ends the reading of God's word. Thanks be to God.
I'm going to have to stop asking you guys to come and sing for us because I just keep sobbing through the songs you guys do. I think one of the reasons that song is just so powerful to me is just coming back from the chaos of being with family who is facing an unexpected death. As I wrote in to many of you who get our electronic newsletter that my son-in-law's grandfather died, and this was the man who raised him. This is back in Oklahoma. And so I went out to Oklahoma to be with the family for the last week. You know, it's amazing in times of grief, all the sort of whatever the edges or frayed edges or the distance doesn't matter. We come together as family, and one of the great privileges of being part of a family is that in that family we can carry the concerns and the vulnerabilities of those in that family together. And so like many families that are facing grief, we gathered for many, many meals. And if you're from Midwest stock, you know, you can even imagine the menu, can't you, right? The casseroles and other things like that. And it was just actually a time for everybody to gather together. In this family, because J.D., the grandfather, had spent years in Alaska following construction work related to the pipeline, we had people coming from all the way northern territories, all the way from the West Coast, and then, of course, around Oklahoma where they're found. It was interesting as we started talking about the family, of course, the number one concern is for J.D.'s beloved wife, Myrna. They met in the 4th grade, and they married before their senior year in high school. And so Myrna has really known J.D. her entire life. And in this, J.D. was the strong and silent and reliable one, and she, as the years have gone by, has become more frail. So the family's really concerned about this. Will she be able to live on her own? She's concerned about this. Will she be able to live on her own? And what does this mean? Does it mean selling the family home? Someone who hasn't driven, is she suddenly going to have to get in that gig again? And all the concern about the family just related understandably about the matriarch. But as they were also talking, they were also expressing concerns about other members of the family. There's a member of the family who was institutionalized years ago for a nervous breakdown. And as this person was struggling with their grief, there were pockets of the family that was gathering and talking with concern about her challenges and who would stand with her. There was also a conversation about one of the young adults in the family who was born with his heart on the wrong side and has had a series of physical challenges and surgeries all his life, spent much of his first year after his birth in the hospital. And as he is now moving into that robust and visionary season of his 20s, those physical ailments still are the shadow that plague him. And the family talked about that and was concerned. There was also concern, a story I hadn't heard before, about one of the members of the family who I hadn't met, because when my kids got married, he was in prison. And so how was he now navigating his life as a felon? And what did that mean for his ability for mobility and for a future? A man who's turned his life tremendously around. And of course, there was just the family just in their grief, for us to hold one another and cry with one another. You know, I found myself thinking about this crazy ragtag family, and it's a remarkable family with all of that Midwest stock that you expect from Oklahomans, to those who have expanded their wings and inhabited all the coasts and even our northernmost territory of our country. And I wondered, would Jesus want to hang out with a family like ours? Would they? Who really would? Except for the fact that they were family. This is a family that has all the sort of edges to it that all of our families have. And what do you think? You think Jesus would want to hang out with my family? Yeah, I think he would. Because Jesus seemed to really love hanging out with people who were vulnerable. He didn't tend to seek out the most powerful. He sought out those who actually were the most vulnerable in society. You'll notice he always was talking and attending to the needs of the physically challenged. There were those in his ministry that demonstrated what we would definitely call, from a modern perspective, all signs of mental illness. He was someone who reached out and made a point of teaching about the poor and the hungry, and then actually fed the hungry himself. Jesus was someone who lived his life in that intersection, in the margins, where people were often left outside of the majority experience and the mainstream experience, and he reached out and touched those who were vulnerable. In fact, one of his most famous parables, it's one of my favorites, it's told in two places in the scriptures, one in Matthew 18 and then also in Luke 15. Especially in Luke, where Jesus is telling about lost things. He's talking about the value of every person, and he then uses the image of a woman who's lost a coin and turns her house upside down to find it. There's also a story about a lost son. We call it the prodigal son story. But there's also in that same chapter a story about the lost sheep. And Jesus tells the parable this way. He says, well, if you had a flock of 99 sheep and one of them get lost, what would you do? You'd go out and find that little booger, wouldn't you? No matter whether it was his fault or not, you'd go out and find him and you would bring him back. And he says, and you would be so thrilled that you found that one lost sheep that you would throw a party. And like many of us, at least for me, one of my favorite images from Sunday school is the picture of Jesus with the sheep over his shoulder. Right? Jesus says, the insignificant ones, the vulnerable ones, they matter to me, and therefore they should matter to you. It makes me think about who are some of the more vulnerable people in our congregation and in our community. And of course, one of the first things that springs to mind are the older and the elderly, the more frail in our community. And it's not surprising that our deacon ministry has an extensive outreach to those who are homebound now. So on our communion Sundays, communion is taken out into the home so that they feel a part of us and still can experience worship. New England Club Worship is one of those expressions of that. People who may not be able to come to church, we bring worship to where they are. There's extensive ministries of card writing and visits, and we do this informally and formally all over the place because we want to value those that are part of our community who may be older and more frail. But there are other groups in our community that we may not be as conscious of. Let's think about that for a minute. Who are some of those groups that may be very vulnerable? Well, you know, NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, tells us that 1 in 5 people in a single year will struggle with issues of mental distress and mental illness. 1 in 5, 20% of us. That, if you look around the room, doesn't mean it exists outside of the church. It exists right here in our community. It exists in our families. It exists in our neighborhoods. It exists in our workplaces. And yet, how many times have we made it a stigmatizing thing if we were to say that we're suffering from depression or anxiety? Or what if we're someone who struggles with bipolar or with schizophrenia or any number of things? In fact, going back to my Oklahoma family, that family member who did have that nervous breakdown said that when she had that episode in her life, the group she didn't tell was the church, because she was too ashamed. And so they made up a story that she had some sort of contagious flu so that no one would be able to find her. Unlike this song that we just heard, we want to be found when we're in our most darkest places, those intersections of suffering and pain. And when the church is a place that we can't talk about our vulnerabilities. I don't think that's the kind of community that Jesus was talking about when he said, go out and find that one vulnerable, lost sheep. But what about others in our midst? According to the Census Bureau, 1 in 6 Americans are afflicted with some sort of disability. And how the Census Bureau defines that is anyone who has a hearing, a sight, a cognitive, mobility, or some sort of inability to live independently, or has some compromise of that, would be considered disabled. That means 1 in 6 people are facing challenges, and yet the church is a place that rarely accommodates those kinds of disabilities. Now, sometimes we will acknowledge those ones that are kind of silent, right? Or those exist, again, in the margins where we don't talk about them. But, let's be honest, it's expensive to accommodate people who have physical disabilities that require ramps and different kinds of bathrooms. We sort of end up doing this kind of benefit analysis. Are really those the kind of people that are going to bring in more people into the life of the church? Is it efficient for us to have this kind of ministry? You know what? Jesus never did that kind of cost analysis. He didn't sit there and say, what's the cost benefit of inviting people who have different abilities into my ministry? He just was present for those who were struggling, or those who had embraced, those who had the gifts of those different abilities. You see, Jesus sees every person in their challenges and says they are welcome. When we look into another one of Jesus' great parables, this is from Luke chapter 14. And this is where Jesus has been invited to this incredible banquet. It's kind of interesting about Jesus. If you invite Jesus to eat, he comes. If it was the Pharisees and a great prominent person, he comes. If it's a tax collector, he comes. If it's sitting on the side of a mountain and it's time to eat, he'll ask you if you have any resources, and he'll make bread somehow appear for everyone. Jesus likes hanging out with people. But he was at a particular party, and I just think sometimes Jesus can't help himself. He has to stir the pot, doesn't he? So he's at the home of a prominent Pharisee, it says in Luke chapter 14, and he's noticing how everyone's being seated at the table. And as was their custom in that time, there was nothing unusual about this. He noticed that the person that had the most power or was afforded the most respect was given the head of the table, and Jesus begins to make comment on this. And then he tells this story. Imagine if you were the host of this very lovely dinner party, and your guest said, well, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return, because then you would be repaid for your kindness. But when you give a banquet, like you, host, that invited me, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. That's the kind of kingdom that Jesus wants us to live in. You see, Jesus sort of poked at this host, but he also pokes at us. He pokes at our attitudes. He really is questioning, what are your biases? What are those unconscious things that you privilege one over another, and you miss out on the call to find that one lost sheep, the vulnerable one in your midst? And Jesus wants us to pay attention to that. You see, Jesus sees the poor, the lame, the crippled, the blind, the mentally ill, the physically challenged. He sees them in all their challenges. He sees the potential of their lives. He actually sees their giftedness and what they bring to the table. They're not just people to take from us. They're people that actually have something to give. But he also sees all of us. He sees the challenges that each one of us has in reaching out, because sometimes it's difficult to be generous when we're pressed to the max. Let's be honest. It's difficult to listen to the story of someone who's challenged with some sort of mental illness, to hear the story one more time or respond to one more crisis when we're spiritually drained. It's difficult to keep asking to contribute and give and serve someone who may have challenges that are beyond the scope of what we can do. And yet Jesus says, these are the people that are also important to me. Because of their value, I'm asking you to value them. Because I was willing to expend my energy with them on the margins, I'm inviting you to do the same, to make a difference. And what does that mean for us? It means, yes, we do all that giving, but we also have to remember that people who are vulnerable present us with tremendous gifts. It's not just a one-way street. And when we don't engage with people who have vulnerabilities, we miss their wisdom. We miss their experience. We miss their stories. And their stories and their experience and their wisdom helps us to be better community of faith. People who struggle with physical disabilities, for example, can remind us of the power of being interdependent on one another. Perhaps one of the greatest sins of America is that I can do it and I can do it alone. But the song that we heard today from Fluidity spoke about the need to reach out and to receive a helping hand, but also to ask. You see, there's a giftedness that comes, a way that you are formed and developed that shapes your character, that says we're all interconnected. And that's actually, folks, more biblical than our American independence. Or what about the depths of compassion that can be developed for someone who engages in some sort of area in their life where they're not part of the normative majority? You see, they bring a wisdom as an outsider or someone else who can remind us and tell us and shape our compassion and inspire us to be different kind of people. Back to that Oklahoma family of mine. The matriarch of that family is an amazingly courageous Christian. I was stunned by her resilience in light of the fact that her soulmate of 60 years had passed on. Her faith was one that was holding on, and she was clinging to it with dear life. And she said, I have to honestly face the challenges that are here. I don't know if I'm going to have to sell my house. I don't know what's ahead. And she said, and very likely my physical decline will only continue. But she said to me, but no one can take away the gift that I have to pray for people. I can still contribute to the family, to the society, to my circle of faith. Or what about that young man in our family who had so many physical challenges? You see, he was adopted as a child with fetal alcohol syndrome, and not only the witness of his parents who took this child who they knew would have challenges, he himself, in having to face these challenges, now is wanting to serve overseas as someone in Guatemala who will help those who are on the margins, because he says, I get it. I know what it's like to have medical care given, and I know the challenges, and I want to be part of a community that reaches out and deals with the vulnerable. Or what about the person in the family who'd had the mental breakdown? As I watched her move and sit with one of the other young people in our family who is struggling with depression. She was just able to be a quiet presence, to encourage her, so that she knew that she would be able to get through this. You see, for all the challenges and all the vulnerabilities, there was tremendous gifts, and the family needed those gifts, just like we, the church, need the gifts of the vulnerable in our community. You see, Jesus asks us to move into that space of love. He says to us, when times are tough, and there will be times that are tough, it's really simple, folks. Take that extra step, extend that extra hand, and then be willing, as you help, to receive the gifts. Jesus chose love over and over again and invites us to do the same. In the midst of pain, choose love.